Who are you? Take a moment and ask this question. Who am I? This one question composes an entire yoga practice on its own, an entire system of yoga, the yoga of self-inquiry. Who am I? This can be such a powerful practice if we ask this question every day. Now, when we first start to ask this question, we often come up with very superficial answers. My name is Andrew, I'm 30 years old, I'm from Canada, I have a sister, parents, I live here, I do this, blah, 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 blah. What this shows us is this starts to show us how we define ourselves. When we ask, who am I? Whatever comes up is a definition of who we think we are. Now, the great yogis will say, whenever we define ourselves, we create contraction, we create limitation, which ultimately leads to suffering. When we define ourselves, we create an attachment to something. And all attachments eventually lead to suffering because everything changes. Everything's in a constant state of flux. So ask yourself this and see, how are you defining yourself? Often as we go a bit deeper, we start to define ourselves by our possessions. You know, I have this house, I have this car, I have this wife, I have this family. Maybe we start to define ourselves by what we do. You know, I go to school, I study chemistry, I work here, I travel, these kinds of things. But these things are not who you are, because who you are, you have always been. What's the difference between you now and you when you were 15 years old, 10 years old, 5 years old? Some part of you has always been there. That's who you are. You haven't always had this job or this house or this relationship or this career. So when we define ourselves by something that we haven't always been or won't always be, again, it leads to suffering. Because eventually it will end. It will change. So who are you? A lot of times we identify with our body. You know, I am this body. Now right away it's obvious. When I was 5 years old, my body was this big. Now my body's this big. Probably when I get older, my body will shrink a little bit again. You know, so the body is always changing, and it's very understood in today's society that if we're attached to the body, we start to suffer. And for this reason, there's so much cosmetic surgery and stuff about changing the way the body's looking. And this inevitably leads to suffering. Because we're not the body. The body is always changing. Now the big one that we get attached to and we start to define ourselves by is our personality. Now in Latin, persona is the mask. It's the mask that they wore for the theater and helped to project the voice. Persona is a mask. Your personality is a mask. And if anyone has, you know, family members and friends that they act different around, you know how easy it is to change your mask. You know, when I'm around my grandmother, I'm a lot different than I was when I was around my friends in high school, for example. So when we're attached to our personality, again, it can lead to suffering. When we define ourselves by our personality, by our actions, by our behaviors, by our thoughts, again, it will lead to suffering. And I know many people, myself sometimes as well, you know, we look back to how it was when we were young, you know, the things that we did there, and it was so much fun, and we had so much energy. If we're attached to that, we suffer right now. So who are you? Who is it that has always been there? Who is it behind the mask? Who are you? When we start to ask this question over and over, when we make it a practice, who am I? Who am I? Without really looking for an answer, we can start to detach from our definition of ourselves. We can start to detach from these attachments we have. And then we realize, you know, I'm not my possessions. They're not really that important to understand who I am. You know, I'm not my career. It's not really important to understand who I am. I'm not my body. I'm not this. I'm not that. And suddenly, We're not caught up in this game of trying to find things from the outside to define ourselves. I don't need this truck that costs more than I can afford. I don't need this job that stresses me out of my mind all day and night. I don't need these things to feel comfortable and confident with who I am, because who I am is inside, not outside. So who are you? Thank you. Namaste.